Thank you, Beth. So I'm here tonight as a lady who digs in the dirt, not a historian. And I want to, before we begin, just do a little housekeeping. We've set up a display that has information about the project I'll address at the very end of the program, the beautification of Crane Park, which has been the last 5 years. And at the back is Kalamazoo in Bloom. How many of you are familiar with Kalamazoo in Bloom? Well, I hope before the end of the night you value that program and that perhaps you consider giving to that in memory of someone, or just simply because it's a wonderful beautification project for the city. Monica Tron is here. She's the director of that, or she's in the back. She'll be glad to answer questions. I also have a few of the Crane Park volunteers that are here tonight, and I would welcome that you ask them questions. Hopefully, the reason I said yes to this is actually a recruiting, so that maybe you'll join me in keeping Crane Park as beautiful as it's becoming again. As I said, I'm not a historian, but I want to thank the Kalamazoo Public Library for the assistance they gave me. The archives here are wonderful, and if you want to research history, your own personal history, we have a wonderful team of librarians and facility to help you do that. So please make use of it. I also want to thank Pamela O'Connor. Any of you know Pam? Wonderful, wonderful citizen of our community who helps keep alive our history, and she does a great deal to support programs like this. So she shared her notes with me a few years ago. I also want to thank John Urschel. I've not met John. Is John here tonight? John published a book. I have a sample of it over on the table about the parks of Kalamazoo. And you can, I believe, I asked the city to bring some down. We could sell them. There may not be many left, but it is a wonderful book to have if you like the history of our city through the parks. So my notes are coming from those basic resources and then my own experience. As Beth said, I've lived in Kalamazoo since 1978. I lived on Crane. How many of you live in the Westnedge Hill neighborhood? Wonderful. Great place, isn't it? I raised my sons there. I love it. I still live there. After 13 years of living on Crane, I moved across the street because the baseballs were going through my backyard windows. I got a little bigger yard. I live on Glenwood, which is really parallel to Crane, just on the other side of Westnedge. During that time, I've seen the changes in the park, and over the years, my husband and I both have served on the Kalamazoo Parks and Recreation Board. My husband served, I think, 2 terms. I served 2.5 terms. And because that park is so near and dear to my heart, I can't let it go. When I could no longer serve, I said, "You have to serve again, honey." So he's now back on the Parks Board. So if you have a concern about a park, please remember my name and let me know how we can help with that particular concern. How many of you have been married in Crane Park? Anyone here tonight that was married in Crane Park? I've met 3 people that live, Gail, okay. And Gail lives on Grandview now, so that's wonderful. It's a pleasure as we work in the park, and I see about 5 or 6 of you. Raise your hands if you've been working in the park. PK, Mike, Gail, lots of folks. Rosemary's back here. We get people stopping to tell us stories, wonderful stories about what happened with their family in the park. Picnics, weddings, prom pictures. How about prom pictures? Anybody do a prom picture? Right now, did you, Sue? You did prom pictures? Wow. Okay. I know they're busy already. And soon there isn't a weekend that the park is not busy with weddings. Weddings Friday night, 2 on Saturday, 2 on Sunday. Very busy. So we do our gardening on the weekdays because of those kinds of things that go on in the park. So Crane Park is located, most of you probably know that location, but just in case you didn't, I put a little Google finder here for us. It's interesting, we're involved right now, and there are some master gardeners and local business owners involved in looking at the island of Crane Park. Do you know what I'm talking about? As Crane Park was divided by Park Street, Westnedge, and Park There's an island out there with some Norfolk pine that now have diplodia, and there's a big issue about industry wants to cut those down so we can see billboards. And I just recently finished the battle with the billboards and can say that the city, we only can have 4 because of what we did as a committee. But anyway, we're involved in that. This should open, and it probably isn't going to. About the time I want it to work. Well, most of you probably know where the park is, so we'll just move right along and not worry about this location. Anyway, that island is going to be developed. We hope it gets into the master plan for the parks and will be landscaped to make it much more attractive, a little bit more usable for you as a park piece of property. And it is to the left of that sign. And so be watching for displays that will tell you what goes on. And if you want to get involved and support it financially, that would be wonderful. This is a relatively new sign for the city of Kalamazoo. I think last year they put that sign up. Now, how many of you have been in the park recently? Quite a few of you? Okay. We'll start by looking at one of the homesteads that is adjacent to the park. It is not in Crane Park, but it has a history that involves what happens in the park over the years. Deacon Martin Haydenberg was one of the early settlers of Kalamazoo, and he was actually a missionary who came and was a carpenter as well to the city. He had a barn raising kind of event to build the home that was first located on what eventually was Dingley Road, changed to Betsy Ann Place, and then now it's Summit. This is where there are new condos. Have any of you familiar with that? Well, this was actually one of the oldest homes left in Kalamazoo until it was razed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. He owned about 200 acres of land, farmland. He was a dairy farmer at the time and some other kinds of farming. I've heard tell that the hill had orchards, apple orchards and some other things as well. I don't know whether that was part of his farm or just story that is out there. He sold approximately 4 acres of that land to the city in a short period of time after he moved there. So he played a part in the fact that that was the first land that was not really considered park at that time. It was bought to be a gravel pit, and the gravel from that area was used to build the early roads in Kalamazoo. It became a very lucrative site because of the gravel that came out of there, and actually valued it much more than what the city paid for it because of that. Now, when we look at that piece of land, it is very changing in elevation. If you walk into the park, it is a hill as it moves to the east. There's a large area that's flat, and then it moves back in, and if you've been there as a kid, my children went sledding in the far back. It's very hilly, very steep as it goes down to Burdick. Is anybody able to visualize that? So from Westnedge to what is Burdick, the park slopes down. Interesting about Deacon Haydenberg, his daughter was considered the first white child born in what was the village of Kalamazoo at that time. Interesting. He also is buried in the Mountain Home Cemetery. Some of you have walked through that, and I know, do you give tours of that, Lynn?
Yeah, we do it again.
So maybe we could look for Haydenberg, and his wife is supposedly buried there as well. In 1910, Edward Dingley took residence in that home, and so the Haydenbergs had moved on. Dingley was the editor of the Kalamazoo Telegraph. Anybody have any connection to that? Okay. And he built the little street that then became called Dingley, and that connected what was then Park going down. Park had a different name prior to that. Park Street into then that area where there were homes. Eventually there were 3 houses in there. Now there are condos, and I think one of those residents still exists that was built a lot later. Another resident of the Haydenburg house was Fuller, and he came in 1919. So Crane Park, the parcel of land, it wasn't identified as Crane Park, but it still was part of city property now for over 200 years. And it's interesting how park properties come to the city, whether they're gifted or they purchase them, how they're deeded to the city. And what's interesting about that is what can the city then do years later when they might, as they are now, underfunded. Looks interesting to maybe sell some land, and that was how I actually got involved, is when they tried to sell part of Crane Park back in the 80s. Do any of you remember that? Were any of you part of that? Yeah, so continuing just a little bit more with Haydenburg's home, Scott Field's family were in residence there for about 35 years. They were considered the longest residents in this home. And I'm sad that it's no longer there, but private entities raised it probably in the late 80s, early 90s. In 1960, they began to build another house there, and this was the home of James Moran. Mr. Moran later was embroiled in the controversy over the purchasing of land from the city to develop the condos. That did not go through because of the neighborhood reacting, and actually citizens citywide got involved in that, and it went away. The whole proposal kind of faded. He changed the name of Dingley Road to Betsy Ann Place after his wife, and when I moved here, it was called Betsy Ann Place in 1978. It just currently was changed probably, I don't know, in the last decade to Summit Place. That house then was torn down in 1989. And it'd be interesting to know the controversy around that, because as I said, I think it was one of, if not the third, the first or the oldest home in Kalamazoo when it was raised. So we lost an important piece of history when that happened.
Was this the house that was in Crane Park?
It was adjacent to the park. If you think of the park, if you're a bird, an aerial view, it's sort of an L shape along Park. And in that L, the very front faces north downtown. You can view a beautiful view of the city. There are flagstone walkways there still, and there are remnants of walls, but it's overgrown, and we have not gardened in there at all. But adjacent to that, what would be the back end of the L, to fill it in, is where these houses were.
Where the tennis court is, I mean,
Diagonally from it. So if you went north and a little bit east, you would be where these houses were. Right now the condos are there. They've torn them down. I don't know that name.
Shakespeare is on the other side of Westnedge. It's on the west side and a little south.
They're asking about the Shakespeare house, the other side of Westnedge. Yeah. South? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, please help me. If you know something, I'm more than glad to have you throw that information out. That first parcel of land then was on the northwest corner. The northwest corner. And so as you look at the park, it's really what faces Park Street. That strip of land that faces Park Street. Okay. Almost goes, it's not all the way down to Maple. Obviously there's a business there and some land that's privately owned, but that would be the area that was part of the gravel pit. And as I mentioned, they didn't pay very much for those 4 acres to today's money, but $4,000 back in the 1800s was a lot of money. Was a lot of money. But they felt it was definitely worth it. Westnedge Hill was called Haydenburg Hill, named after then Deacon Hill, for quite a period of time. And I'm not sure when Colonel Westnedge became important and they changed the name. There was, and again in my research, I saw 2 different roles, and perhaps this individual Crane. The Crane house is still located on the corner of Crane Street and Grandview. Some of you have seen. The Ward family have done a wonderful job renovating it. It's a lovely old home. that faces the park. This parcel of land was left by Crane. Now, some of the research I saw said that he was a lawyer, and some said he was a realtor. So we just know he was a prominent business person. Maybe that would be the best way to, to address his role in our community. And he gifted the city upon his death, the second parcel of land. And I'm going to say that that's the part that you enter off of Grandview. Okay. Several years later, the city acquired a third parcel directly that says Sound to the south of the other two. And I'm not sure if they bought that and for how much. I could not find that information. But those three parcels of land were not unified to make it a park for quite a while. They stayed separate parcels. In 1912, they began looking at it as a park, and they dedicated it on Memorial Day, but it still was not unified as all three parcels being the park. Garfield, and we just celebrated Arbor Day last Friday. This is the gentleman who founded Arbor Day, actually gave a speech here in Kalamazoo, and he was one of the keynotes on that dedication day. He worked for the Michigan Forestry Commission at that time, so we can be proud of the fact that we have a strong connection to Arbor Day through this speaker. The city intended to double the size of the park by acquiring more land, but they did not. Okay. So whatever reason, they did not. These were some illustrations or photos in the archives here at the library that were tagged that they were part of the construction during this time of the park. Now, if it had been a gravel pit, obviously there had to be a lot of contouring or leveling and filling to make it a little bit more accessible as a park. But interesting to see that precipice in the one photo and then the gentleman standing on the top of it. In 1914, and this would be that front hill, they began to seed it and actually treat it like a grassy park. So as you walk along the crest and on the far north, how many of you have been on that crest to see the city, the view? You could look down. It's beautiful, isn't it? We have to donate lots of money so they can renovate that part of the park, rejuvenate it so we can have benches and look out over the city. If you can imagine 100 years ago looking out over the village of Kalamazoo, the lush green, it would have been a beautiful, beautiful, peaceful place. Now we chase the kids out that are smoking pot. And 5 years ago we actually had to deconstruct someone's homeless shelter in one of the water features that were in that part of the park. So some sadness in that. That whole area became a playfield, and right now there is still remnants of a wall that create a room at that lower level of the park. Years ago they raised two stone structures that had been put up during the WP era. One was a comfort house, they called it, and the other was a tool shed. But they'd been vandalized and they were old, and so because of the danger and liability, they were raised by the city a while ago. But that area was a playfield, and it still is a very nice open area. We see a lot of people coming to throw frisbees and chase their dogs and all sorts of things down in that part of the park. It's adjacent to the tennis courts. Okay. In the 1915, the Parks and Boulevard Commission recommended then that they actually create a unified park with these parcels of land. And the city council did pass that. And so now we took all three parcels, it became Crane Park. Obviously they had to still deal with more grading because of the use of the land prior to this. And for about a decade, not much else went on in the park. Crane Park at that point was valued at about $15,000. I don't know what it's valued at today. That would be an interesting question of Sean Fletcher, the manager of the City Parks and Recreation Department. At the time, Crane Park, there were 2 or 3 other large parks, and obviously Bronson was one of them. The city at that point also was known to have more square footage dedicated to park than large cities like St. Louis. On average, they had 340 square feet of park for each citizen. Today, I think there's something in our charter or the city's laws that say they have to have 100 square feet for every citizen. We're under that, unfortunately. The city doesn't have funds to buy more land as the city has grown. At the time in 1919, the park was only 8.3 acres. It's now over 10 acres. So there was some acquisition of additional land at some point. In the 30s and through about 1945, then we had the Depression. We had some things that came to benefit us, and one was obviously FDR's Work Progress Administration, the WPA. They worked with the city. We still have family in Kalamazoo that are related to B. Leroy Gilbert, who was the park superintendent. In fact, Mr. Gilbert was the uncle of Judy Goodling, who just recently passed away, and Norm still lives in the Westnedge Hill neighborhood and gardens in Crane Park, and he's in his late 70s, so go for it, Norm. He helps us out. Mr. Gilbert had the foresight to put into play great plans. He eventually stepped down as the superintendent of park to be the city planner, or manager, isn't it? Manager is our term. And Nicholas Kick then became the superintendent of parks. And Kick Pool, have you gone swimming there, is named after him. Another key player, and Mr. Manzillo's family lived in Kalamazoo for a long period of time after, was the gardener. He had immigrated to the United States from Sicily and had quite a resume. He worked for the Chicago Lincoln Park. He also worked for the Upjohn Company, and eventually the Upjohn family asked him to work for them again, and he left the city employment to work with Mrs. Upjohn. But what we saw, and I'll show some pictures in just a moment, were the result of these 3 men working together. So those WPA workers, because of that program, they absorbed 80 to 90% of the costs that you're going to see. And some of the structures that were created then still are in the park. They have a different look, but many of those structures have actually been raised or redone. Okay, they set up what 3,481 square feet of rock wall and terraces. Many of the terraces that remain are on the far northern part of the park that's overgrown. The rock wall was raised in the 90s. I'll show you a picture. And large river boulders were put in. Well, actually, it's been done twice. Are now there. They also laid 8,535 square feet of road, hauled 2,232 square yards of earth. Now, those of us that have been in the park the last 5 years, we've hauled 25 yards of bark for 5 years. So lots of folks have hauled a lot of earth over there. They also made additional walls. These pine trees face Park Street. When you look up, some of you might remember there used to be a bed that was done in annuals that said Crane Park. Does anybody remember that? And that became very difficult to maintain. There's no water there. That was another concern. And eventually perennials were put in, but now that's all been cleaned out and it's just sort of grass. But these trees are back behind that. These would have been trees planted by the WPA workers that are still there. Many of the other trees, though, have over the years been struck by lightning or the wind, and so not not as many are in existence. Okay, but they did plant quite a few. They also helped build those tennis courts, which gets used quite a bit. They get used by the tournament that comes to town in the summer. They are used by the local residents, and the neighborhood have gatherings and use that area of the hill for neighborhood things. They had a garden plan then that required that they level a lot more, fill it in. They wanted to make these formal gardens. The plan behind this was to highlight the hotbed industry and to show homeowners how they might be able to plant their city lot. So in doing that, they put in some formal gardens and then some other gardens that changed with the plantings yearly. There is a reflecting pool still, and I'll show you some pictures of that in a moment. Over the decades, it changed. The Kalamazoo Garden Clubs planted it with beautiful, colorful flowers. Then it was planted with hostas, and now it has a topiary thanks to C.J. Drenth, who led the design of the Kalamazoo in bloom with all the topiaries down in Bronson Park. We were given a crane, and so we turned that reflecting pool into what we could, with flowers, design it as a pond. Okay. There were a lot of boxwood shrubbery. I remember moving and there was a very formal rose garden. Did any of you remember that? I've got a couple pictures of it. It was lovely. When I moved here, there was a full-time gardener and 2 part-time gentlemen that were in the park. And there were formal beds still with rose boxwood around them and roses in the middle and all sorts of shrubbery. Much of that is gone just because of the time span, but also probably maintaining is a challenge when you have to trim or prune things of that nature. They had 4 basic gardens, east, west, and I'll show you the center one. Does anybody remember? Can you identify this? This is where we've placed Whoopi, our crane. We named him Whoopi. And now when you come to the park, you'll see some pictures in a minute of how that reflecting pool has changed. This is looking north. You could be standing on Grandview, which would be about a half a block behind you, and looking north. What you'll find now is that center bed that has what looks like to me boxwood has been narrowed down, and at the far end then become the formal beds that we now have. If you've been in the park, maybe you can visualize that. You can see that there were some formal gardens planted, and that would have been a lot of work for Mr. Manzullo. The documents I read said he gardened day and night. He'd even garden late into the night when it was cool. And gardened long, long hours to keep that park as beautiful as it was. There were crushed stone walkways and other things. A little later, that V apparently stood for Victory Garden. Did any of you hear about that? They actually grew vegetables in Crane Park and donated them to the Children's Hospital. So that was I think that the vegetables were grown on the lower level, though, down where we now have a small shed. I don't believe they were grown in this formal garden. But that V stood for, I believe, the Victory Garden that they were celebrating. This was the East Garden. Again, you're facing north. This would be just a little further down. And some of you that are here tonight that work in the park, Mike, this is that area we're going to redo. We just took out some bushes that were extremely overgrown and tired, and we're hoping to revitalize them. It's adjacent to what we call the wedding room. Is anybody familiar with the wedding room? Sort of the center room of the park. The feel of rooms is still there because of the plantings, the shrubbery, and some of the trees, but you don't have that crushed walkway. That's gone. That left in the 70s. Okay. Center Garden, Again, these are all facing north. These are images from the Kalamazoo Public Library files. You can access these online as well if you're at all interested in looking at them. So we can see that these were beautifully manicured gardens. How many hours do you think it would take to keep it looking like that? Unbelievable. I'll tell you, on our record year in the 5 years, our volunteers put in over 900 hours. 900 hours. Last year it was half that, but there were reasons. They used, as I said then, some of the literature or some of the historical documents said they used native plants, but I'm going to differ in that when I came in the 80s, there were very few native plants in the park. There were perennials, but I believe most of those were used as demonstration beds, and somewhere over time they used the term native and should have said annuals. Those beds were highlighting the annual plants. There were formal gardens, but they were not the most plants. They planted something like 15,000 annuals a year during the heyday of the park. The lots that we the plots that we now maintain are about 40 by 20, and they were to emulate then a typical city lot, a 60-foot city lot, to give a homeowner an idea of what they could do in their garden. Okay. And there are 12 of these plots still left, and that's what we consider the perennial beds today. In 1942, they actually had won a horticultural award for what the gardens looked like, and they also had up to 225,000 visitors recorded that year, which is a lot. They said it was only a third of what the number was that visited Millam. So people were coming to Kalamazoo to the parks. Okay. And I wish we could even get $3,000 today. I think we get a tenth of that. Again, Mr. Manzullo can be thanked for his dedication to the park, the many years that he worked there. These beds took a lot of love and certainly many, many hours. So you can see, I think I've already shared these facts with you that were there. There was a revival of the rose garden, but that's a very sad story. We planted, I can't remember how many dozens of rose bushes, and overnight they were all stolen. Oh. This was in the 80s. Yeah, it was a very sad thing. So when that happened, there were some real changes in how we planted in the park, because you can imagine the cost of that. These are some of the flowers that I found in the documents that were planted there, things that obviously we probably still are planting in our yards. But only a few perennials were listed. This is why I question the term I found native plants, because the only native plants I saw mentioned in Lupin isn't even really a native, were perennials, lupins, and tulips. I didn't find mention of others. Also, those are all annuals. And the Victory Garden. The master gardeners have a growing garden out behind, let's see, can you help me? Who knows? It's behind Humphrey and what's the other? Kendall Electric, is it? Off of Sprinkle. And they've been donating over 10,000 pounds of food to the local food banks every year. So when we look at the need for gardening to provide fresh produce for those who don't have, it's still very strong. So Kalamazoo does have an active population helping with that same concept as the Victory Garden during the Depression. These are some pictures then from the 50s. These are from the Kalamazoo Garden Council website. And there were many, many gardeners from the clubs that have played a very important role in the park over the years from the 50s to the 80s. You can see these look like rose beds, gladiolas. We have no gladiolas anymore, and some other things. hard to identify. In the 70s, and this was when I moved here, we had a change in gardeners. There still were assigned gardeners to the park. There were 3 people in and out of there. Today, the city parks only have 3 employees that are working in the parks. So they have summer help, but it's pretty dire situation. In 1973, the front flower bed that you saw as you drove down Park was eliminated. Again, that part of the park has no water. We only have water down the walkway between the perennial beds, and there's 1 sprinkler head in the wedding room and 1 sprinkler head in another room. So it's very hard to maintain perennials unless you use a native type of perennial in that kind of situation. And as I mentioned, there were raising of walls. They were no longer safe. Approximately 55 different varieties were planted in the park. There was support in the 70s from the city, but at this point in time, we begin to see a lot of the garden clubs picking up where the city could not do. So we need to thank all those men and women who, again, gave volunteer hours in those projects. In the 80s, there was the controversy over selling a portion of the land. I was a part of forming what was called Neighborhood Watch. Do you remember that? Still a good thing to have. And because we had every street, we had lots of phone numbers, we had most of the hill, both sides of Westnedge on lists so that people could quickly call a neighbor if you thought there was a problem. We were able to get people together to rally to ask the city not to sell this land. We were also fortunate that we had professionals in the neighborhood, an attorney in particular, who did a great deal of work. Research was done to find out that the way the land was deeded, it could not be sold. It had to stay park. An end of discussion. So that was about a 2 to 3 year pretty bitter fight. There were a lot of letters written, a lot of meetings, a lot of citizens spoke, and your voice matters. So if there's something you are not happy about, I want to encourage you to speak up. It's very important that you do take action. A volunteer program then was set up, and we were told that the city was going to sell it, and if they couldn't sell it, they couldn't maintain it, so it was going to become a mowed park, which meant everything would be cleared, leveled, and seeded so that they could come in and mow and be done. That would have been devastating, right? So the Westnedge Hill neighbors, through the volunteer system, came back. Sandy Adams, do any of you know Sandy? Gary Lee McCormick headed a team that then organized the garden clubs in a much more formal way. Each of them took a perennial bed and maintained it for about the next 20 years. So the Peony Society had a bed, the Iris Society had a bed, the Kalamazoo Garden Club had a bed, many others. There were 4 of the 12 beds that were maintained just by neighbors. So from 1980 on, I have maintained what we consider, I think it's bed 10, no, 9. Anyway, there's a tree planted there. The neighbors planted it in memory of my mother who had passed away. We maintained those beds on our own. And what stock went into it was from your own gardens. So every bed looked different. And they were not necessarily planted to the soil type, to the amount of sunlight. They were planted to that group of gardeners and what their interests were and maybe what plants they could bring to the park. It was beautiful, but it wasn't organized. Okay? And as time went forward, we had changes in how we live our lives. People were not joining garden clubs as often, or the members were aging and kneeling in the park is not as easy. So we saw that the volunteering kind of dwindled, and that meant then that the beds kind of took a hit. Also at this point, the Haydenburg home was destroyed and things were changing down in the park. These are some photos of what the garden clubs were doing. Beautiful, quite colorful. Still very attractive, but it was not an organized plan. Now there's that reflecting pool done probably, it looks like maybe begonias, where before it had been a water feature. So it's historically still there, but it's no longer a water feature. And you can see the remnants of shrubbery that now is gone. There were trellises put in, and they're still there. They're covered with jasmine and, gosh, what else is on those? I don't know if it's clematis. One has clematis, and then the summer and fall clematis. There's some more photos. You can see the perennial beds down the walkway. That walkway still exists, but when the park gets updated, this will be changed to a surface that is accessible to all. The grass is something that may or may not stay, so that more people have access to the park. This is the wall that was raised. This is the third structure that I know of that was on the front of the park on Park Street. This was done in 1991. And I've noticed at the far northern edge, every now and then there's a path that comes through. There's a path that comes from Burdick through the woods. Then they walk through the park, and then they go back through the woods to get down to Park Street. Those big boulders are being pushed by people jumping off the wall. The comfort station and the tool building were taken down. They were located down near the tennis courts. But there were quite a few things still happening in the park structurally. The funding was declining, but people were still working there. In 2010 begins a project that Norma Smith, who lives also on Westnedge Hill, and I put a proposal together with the Master Gardener's support. That proposal was that we would address only the perennial beds, but it's expanded over the years. We presented it then to the Parks and Recreation Board, and they accepted that. So we are the organization or group called the Crane Park Beautification Project. We would welcome you working with us. We work every Wednesday morning from 9 to 10, or 9 to 11, and every evening, Wednesdays from 6 to 8. We work May through October in maintaining those beds. And we've had 4 Eagle Scout projects, one a year. One was done to rebuild walls. One was done to place a woodland border along the woods so we could gracefully move from the woods into the park. And 2 involved creating native plant beds added to a butterfly bed that we established. Gail Walter's here today, and she can talk to you about that. She has helped us become a certified monarch way station, and she has a few volunteers that help her, and Mike is here too, he can talk about that, going in weekly and counting, looking at every single leaf in the native butterfly plants to count the eggs, and then the caterpillars, and then the chrysalis. So we have a couple great things happening in the park, teaching youth about plants and teaching youth to be volunteers, reestablishing native plants, and giving everyone a green space, a place to find peace and joy and share family time. Okay. Again, we are supported by Kalamazoo in Bloom. So if you're interested in seeing something change in the park, we would welcome a donation of any size through Kalamazoo in Bloom, but you would want to say that it's for Crane Park so that it's set in special funds. We just priced out the project that we would like to do in that island to, again, block the billboards at the bottom of the hill from the residents, to protect the streets from the wind and the snow blowing across, to keep green space in a very busy part of our city to create a beautiful welcoming gate to the downtown at $186,000. Yes? Part of it. That's not part of the park. That actually was that Haydenburg property that was owned, all by all those others. And eventually there were 3 residents back in that area. One still exists. The other two, the Haydenburg and the other one, were raised for the condos to be built. Yeah. So today the park is 10.43 acres. It is classified as a neighborhood park. It does have 2 tennis courts, a drinking fountain, 12 perennial beds, and a wedding room. What's interesting is this couple is kissing under a lovely tree. It's not a tree. Anybody want to know what that is? That's a 100-year-old honeysuckle bush. Seriously. If you go to the park, that's what the kids love to climb in. Have you been in the park and they all climb in it? We've placed a bench there so that, because a lot of prom pictures and others are taken there, but it's a honeysuckle, a very old honeysuckle. So that's what happens to a shrub when you don't prune it. Here's a picture of the start of our butterfly bed. That would have been, 4 years ago, I think was the first one we put in. So we cleared where a tree had fallen. We cleared the land and put in, I think that year we put in about 30 to 40 different types of native plants. We now have over 65 different types of native plants. The second butterfly bed, and that's Troop 204, a great group of young men who planted the next bed and helped. And since then, we've added a 3rd bed and then the woodland border. So please come. This is at the back of the park. It would be on the northeast corner of the park. We're going to clean there on Sunday. Anybody free Sunday? From 1 to 3, we'll even talk to you about native plants and how to save seeds or prepare for having a native plant garden. And I'm going to just show you a couple pictures from the current year from the park, if you don't mind. Are you okay? Can you hang on another few minutes? Okay. So I had 60 folks on my roster, but the honeymoon's over. With any new project, the honeymoon only lasts a little while. So every year we try to have something new and exciting, something educational for the master gardeners. We actually have volunteers who are not master gardeners. We had a 9-year-old who wanted to learn how to garden. We had a couple who moved here from Iran and were learning English, but they loved to garden, and they came down every Wednesday night and learned the English names for things, and they were great gardeners. We have folks that are just neighbors, so it's not just a master gardener initiative. That season said only 234, but we put in actually 400 and some last year. The Master Gardeners give awards. We've won the Zucchini Award twice, which means we've given really high numbers of volunteer hours in the parks, which is great. We don't plant very many annuals, but we will on May 20th. We'd welcome you to come and help us. We plant the one thing that is gives continuity to all 12 beds, and that's a border of one type of flower. We've picked begonias because the deer don't eat them. And so we'll be planting quite a few flats of begonias, and then we'll plant whoopie as well. Wells Fargo Foundation has donated over $1,000 this year toward that project on the island, but they've also adopted a bed, as many businesses in Kalamazoo do, but they were gracious enough, because it's my husband that's employed there, they were gracious enough to always give the funds so we could do whoopie in that particular bed. So it's out of the generosity of folks like you that we can do these wonderful things. So there's whoopie, in his newly planted pond. So come and visit him. The deer used to love the hosta, that was their salad bowl. So we're glad to put something in there that they don't eat right now. This is a view that is parallel to Grandview. You're looking from what would be the back of all the rooms. You're looking to the west. And it's just lovely, just lovely. Different shades, different times of day. Just a beautiful, restful place. Again, you can see that there's still some of the old structure. This is an entrance into the park off of Grandview. To the right would be the wedding room, and to the left is what's left of what would have been the West Garden. And the reflecting pool is just around the curve of those shrubbery. We also won the Star Award for the volunteers. We were recommended and actually won a state award. The Michigan Recreation Parks Association gave us the award for the efforts and the amount of volunteers and the time that was put into the park. So I'm very proud of the folks that have given time there, and I'm pleased that their efforts have been recognized. And again, I said we are a certified Monarch Way Station. We did that about, I think, our second year. We worked on that. And I thank Gail for her contributions. Last year, we split and planted over 100 hostas. These were donated by some master gardeners as they were thinning their beds. And this says only 30, but I think we took 30 plants and turned them into 100 by splitting. But unfortunately, we have our own private herd of deer that love the park. We also planted 3 hydrangea in memory of, or in honoring Norm Goodling and Judy. Her uncle was the one, Gilbert, that designed the park along with Kick and Manzula back in the 40s. We keep splitting, so we started with a plan. In the 12 beds, we studied the first year, which is what good gardeners do. We studied rainfall, we studied sun, we studied soil, and determined that as you enter the park from the west and head down that path, the sun became less intense. And so we used a color scheme. We also knew that new volunteers would be coming regularly, and to have to learn a lot of different plants is challenging. So each bed had 2 main perennials, and that way we can teach someone very quickly, these are the 2 you don't pull, and everything else you can take out. So we start with what red, and there's a plan on that poster on the table. This is the second bed that has yellows. It goes from reds to yellows to pinks to purples to blues and then whites. So it goes from hot to cold as the sun goes from intense to very light. We put in hardscape at the back and some softscape movement with grasses, and then the plants in the front. That's a crocosmia, a bulb plant. Beautiful, wonderful. If you've got full sun, it is just terrific. We do have some things that were there before. This is a gift from one of the garden clubs, a giant plate hibiscus that still blooms. We've left it in the red bed. The first year, I didn't think we would get as much done. I anticipated taking out each bed completely, preparing the soil and replanting what we wanted. So we removed everything in a bed, planted it in another place. We got 5 or 6 beds done the first year. I cannot believe the work that people did. It was amazing. And then the second year started the native gardens and the butterfly beds. We've actually collected milkweed and different seeds and shared those with several different entities to, again, continue the propagation of milkweed or native plants. So if you're interested in the fall, please come down with your own little satchel and we'll help you do that. We want to help you do the collecting so it's done well. This is Joe Pyeweed. This was I think 7 feet tall. Am I exaggerating? It was huge. And again, these beds were planted with some sort of basic schema, but it's taking on its own life, I think. We have pathways through there so that you can get into count the eggs. These are the names of just some of the very dedicated volunteers who've been with us probably all 4 or 5 years, and I want to thank them publicly. And I'll close, and you're welcome to walk around and talk to others with this video. We were blessed by this young man coming to Crane Park. He's going off to school in California, and his father wanted to have a video of him. He's a wonderful cellist. So the young man wrote, I think it's 5 different scores for the Hallelujah, and then played them in his church and then in Crane Park. And this is just a wonderful walk through the park with his music. His name was Brett Howland, and so we gardened to this music one morning, and it was just lovely. This is the treat, if you come work with us, that you'll get. If it comes. I may just come outside of my show to do it. Nope, that's not going to do it. It doesn't want to pick it up. Maybe it's just going to take a moment, you think? You don't know? All right. Should pop up. Yeah, it could be. May not be hooked up to the internet. Just try it. Might be slow. Well, thank you for your patience. Does anyone want to share a story? We'll see if it pops up because it's a wonderful piece. Anybody have something to share? Yes.
Well, I just like, I went to Parkwood School back many years ago, and we actually, the classroom was a little bit, and we had one of the classmates, they had some ducklings, and we picked them over to school, we went to school,
So she went to Parkwood, Upjohn.
and I also started playing tennis on the tennis courts there, so I have a lot of wonderful memories from the park, and right now, actually a painting now over my fireplace that is the picture of Crane Park.
Is it a Mary Berry?
I can't remember.
I have one over there. Have any of you heard of Mary Berry? A local artist does pastels.
No, this is a watercolor.
Oh,
It's a
okay.
watercolor. I don't think that's the name, I can't remember, but
Okay.
it's, but it just, has a lot of memories, so.
I guess we'll
was
switch.
Oh, I see. We used to spend a lot of time over there playing. I lived on Glenwood Drive, so I was a little bit of a walk over there, but not bad. So
Well, good.
I enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you, thank you. I live on Glenwood now. I live in the Stanton's old house, Erie Allen's house. Did you know Erie? Anybody else want to share a story while we're waiting? I guess it's not going to pop up, so. Well, thank you for coming, yes.
I just have a question. So those, okay, I don't change it, but for the pictures from the 40s look so wide open, like you could see them in the film. And now they're so close in, the woods are, so I'm curious about the woods. Is that part of the park, or is that just?
Yes.
It is.
Yes.
So that's just grown up kind of, sort of scrubby looking, but were those trees planted purposely, or what?
I think that probably in the 40s they weren't as tall, and they just have continued to grow. But most of the stock in the park that's 30 to 40 feet high probably are 100-year-old. They were planted a while ago. I do know that in the 50s through the 80s, some of the garden clubs made a terrific effort to plant trees in that area too. So you've lived there for a long time.
Yeah, I take my kids from
tennis court. I was wondering, in the old part of the park, the woods, it looked like there were two ponds down there. Now, is it the city that's been reconstructing them? It looks like
if
there's
there's-
new cement work.
Well, that was where we took down a blue tarp, and someone homeless had built cement block to elevate and thrown a tarp over it. So it wasn't the city's work, it was someone needing shelter. That's just people cutting through, probably from Burdick. Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of activity in the park. Yeah, there's a lot of activity in the park. Some illegal and some not. I think it's a very safe park. Please don't take that anyway, but there's things that go on in all places at all times.
Natalie, I just have a question for you. When the condos were built, there was obviously a big concern about the traffic that people perceived could have happened from Crane into the park and whatever. And do they still have the boulder there that prevents any traffic from coming up that goes to the condos? And what do you know, what are the plans for that?
Okay. When I was on the Parks Board, and Frances Jewell was still the Director of Parks and Recreation, there was a 5-year plan for Crane Park. That's now been set aside, but in that plan we wanted to keep that brick road, but it would not be a road. There were going to be planters in the middle of it. There was even discussion with Sharon Ferraro of using that brick road as a site, a state site, to show others how to rebuild a brick road. So I do not believe that will ever be opened back up, and that is due to, I think, the neighbors not wanting the traffic coming through, rapidly through on Crane Street. So in response to their request, those boulders were put there. The parking will change. The master plan has access again to the tennis courts for someone who might be in a wheelchair or have difficulty with the terrain. There will be angular parking at the tennis courts. Right now there is really inadequate space. So there'll be some changes, but that's all, again, in the planning with city parks, as they put out a 3 to 5 year plan, bid it out, and they rotate each of the big parks. Crane is not it's not a destination park like Millam or Bronson. It's considered a neighborhood park, so a little less priority, a little less funding. But I'm hoping that our master plan, we actually were about 2 more years out, and they were to implement, because I know, Sue, you came to meetings. There were quite a few neighbors that came, and that was 2 years ago. So we are due to be the park that gets attention. So watch for those meetings, because you can make a difference. They wanted to put in barbecue grills and a pagoda. No way. Anybody else? I'm sorry this isn't gonna, but if you get home, play it. It is just a lovely piece. You'll really like it. Thank you again. And thank you to the library for featuring our wonderful neighborhood.